It all started with a damn lasagna. I didn't even like lasagna that much, but Emily swore she'd been perfecting some new recipe she found online. And because I was the doting husband who tried to appreciate the little things, I nodded along, smiled like an idiot, and let her plan a big deal Saturday date night at home. Emily was meticulous about the details. She had the table set like we were hosting royalty, real cloth napkins, candles, a bottle of overpriced red wine, and, of course, the lasagna. The kitchen smelled incredible. That's what made it all the worse, this eerie mix of perfection and unease. Fancy, I said, pulling out my chair. Should I change into a tux or? Emily laughed, a bit too hard maybe, before pouring the wine. You deserve this, babe, she said, her voice sweeter than it needed to be. You've been working so hard lately. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't been doing anything different. My job as a project manager at a software firm was as monotonous as it got. Sure, deadlines were piling up, but that wasn't new. If anything, she'd been the busy one working late, seeing friends I'd never heard of, sneaking off for vague errands that didn't require much explanation. Still, I forced myself to relax. I sipped the wine. I let her play the perfect wife. Halfway through dinner, she stood and smiled brightly. Wait here, I almost forgot. Emily practically danced out of the room, leaving me to sit there chewing my way through the best lasagna I'd ever had, which also annoyed me for reasons I couldn't pinpoint. When she came back, she was holding a small gift bag. Her face was glowing. Suspiciously glowing. I frowned. What's this? A surprise, she chirped, setting the bag in front of me. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those ungrateful guys who whines when his wife does something nice. But there was something off about this moment, like the surprise wasn't for my benefit at all. Inside the bag was a brand new Rolex watch. I blinked, stunned. It wasn't just expensive, it was way out of our budget. Emily, I started slowly, holding it up like it might explode. This is, wow. But how did you? Don't ask questions, she cut in, grinning too wide. Just enjoy it. You deserve it. That phrase again. You deserve it. I deserved a lot of things, sure, but a Rolex? My brain started spinning. Emily's job at the boutique wasn't exactly raking in that kind of cash. Had she gotten a bonus? Did she borrow money? Win a raffle? Nothing added up, but I kept my mouth shut, not wanting to ruin whatever illusion she'd built for herself. Try it on, she said eagerly, leaning forward. The moment the watch clasped around my wrist, I saw it. A flicker of something in her eyes. Nervousness. Guilt. Whatever it was, it passed quickly, too quickly, but I'd seen it. It was the look someone gets when they've just pulled off something and are praying you don't catch on. And that's when the question hit me. A question I didn't want to ask, a question that soured every bite of that goddamn lasagna. Why do I need to be distracted right now? Because that's exactly what this was, a distraction. A shiny, expensive, ticking distraction from something she didn't want me to see. From that moment on, dinner turned into a play I couldn't get out of. I nodded at her stories. I laughed at her jokes. I thanked her for the surprise. But inside, my gut was screaming that something was very, very wrong. And the watch? The perfect watch that didn't belong on my wrist? It felt heavy, like it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets I hadn't uncovered yet. That night, Emily fell asleep quickly, too quickly, while I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the Rolex on the nightstand. Check. Check. Tick. It was like the damn thing was mocking me. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew the answers would come. And when they did, they wouldn't be pretty. She gave me a gift that night. But it wasn't the watch. It was the realization that something in our marriage was already broken. That night, I didn't sleep. Not a wink. The Rolex ticked softly on the nightstand like a clock counting down to something, but I wasn't ready to figure out what. Emily snored gently next to me, lying on her side like she hadn't just flipped my life into some strange puzzle I couldn't solve. She looked peaceful, too peaceful. I stared at her face, the way her hair fell across the pillow, and thought to myself, how well do you really know someone you've lived with for 6 years? By 4:30 in the morning, I couldn't stand being in bed anymore. I swung my legs off the side, grabbed the Rolex, and left the room as quietly as I could. Our living room had this big picture window overlooking the empty street. The kind of view where nothing ever happens. Sitting on the couch, I turned the watch over in my hand, inspecting it like I expected to find some magic answer carved into the stainless steel. But there was nothing unusual, just an expensive watch. A little too expensive. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the gift itself. It was about the fact that Emily hadn't been acting like Emily for weeks now, and I'd been too dumb, too complacent to notice. People think they'd know when their life is about to hit the rocks, that they'd feel the boat shaking long before the crash. But the truth is, you never feel it until you're already drowning. I needed answers. Not vague feelings or guesses, answers. By 7 a.m., I had a plan. Emily usually stayed in bed until 8:30 on weekends, so I had some time. I grabbed my keys, left her a note saying I was heading to the store for coffee and bagels, and slipped out the front door. I didn't go to the store. The first place I went was Emily's car. It was parked right where it always was, at the end of our driveway, covered in the thin layer of dust it always seemed to gather. My hand shook as I unlocked it and climbed inside. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe I thought I'd see something obvious, a receipt, a bag from a store I didn't recognize, a scrap of paper with some stranger's handwriting on it. Instead, the car looked perfectly normal. It smelled faintly like Emily's perfume, the leather seats were pristine, and the cup holder had its usual half-empty water bottle. I started going through the glove box, then the center console, pulling out loose receipts and parking stubs. Nothing stood out until I reached under the passenger seat. My fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. I pulled it out. A black, disposable phone. It sat in my hand like a loaded gun. I didn't even know Emily owned a second phone. My first thought was that maybe she'd bought it as a backup for emergencies, but who buys a backup phone and keeps it under their car seat? My heart thudded as I held down the power button, and the screen lit up. The lock screen didn't ask for a PIN, it just opened. There weren't many apps. A messaging app, the default phone app, and a camera. My thumb hovered over the messaging icon before I finally tapped it. There they were. Messages. Dozens of them. Most were from one number, a contact saved under the name C. My breath caught as I scrolled. The messages were quick, clipped, and way too familiar. C, leaving work early today? Can't stop thinking about you. Emily, I'll let you know. Same place? C, always. 5 p.m. I miss you already. Emily, me too. Don't be late. The last message was sent 2 days ago, at 4:56 p.m. I sat there frozen, staring at the screen as the words blurred together. My chest felt tight, my face hot. Emily was cheating. The answer had been staring me in the face for weeks, hell, maybe months, and I hadn't seen it. But now there was no mistaking it. I scrolled further back. It was all the same. Messages about meeting up. Plans for dinners. Little inside jokes. The worst part was how easy, how comfortable Emily sounded in her replies. Like talking to him was as natural as breathing. At some point, I must have leaned back in the seat because my head hit the headrest hard enough to make me blink. My hands trembled as I held the phone, like I wasn't even sure what to do with it. Smash it? Keep scrolling? Confront her? For a while, I just sat there, breathing heavy and staring at nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to look through the rest of the phone. There were a few photos. Nothing explicit, but enough to tell me everything I needed to know. A picture of Emily's hand holding a glass of wine, her wedding ring clearly removed. A shot of a table for two in some restaurant I didn't recognize. A selfie of her smiling with a shadowy figure just outside the frame. I turned the phone off and shoved it back under the seat like it was radioactive. My head was spinning, my thoughts coming too fast to pin down. Who the hell was C? A coworker? A friend? Someone from the boutique? And how long had it been going on? I got out of the car, slammed the door, and stood in the driveway, breathing hard. The neighborhood was quiet, just rows of houses with perfectly manicured lawns and cars parked neatly in driveways. I wondered if anyone else here was living the same nightmare I was. My hands were still shaking as I got back in my own car and drove to an actual coffee shop. I bought a couple of bagels and a coffee for Emily, just to keep up appearances, even though the idea of eating made me sick to my stomach. When I got back home, Emily was in the kitchen, standing barefoot in one of my t-shirts and pouring herself a cup of coffee. "There you are," she said, flashing me a smile. "I thought you'd run away." Her voice was light, teasing. "Happy." I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "You're up early," I said flatly, setting the bag of food on the counter. "Couldn't sleep." She took a sip of her coffee, watching me over the rim of her mug. "Everything okay?" For a second, I almost broke. Almost threw the phone on the counter and demanded answers. But I stopped myself. I didn't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I just wasn't ready to hear the lies I knew were coming. Instead, I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah. Everything's fine." Emily grinned and kissed me on the cheek. "Good. I'm starving." "What did you get?" As she unpacked the bagels, I leaned against the counter and watched her. She looked so normal, like the woman I'd married. But now I knew the truth. And I wasn't going to let it slide. I just had to figure out what to do next. The day after I found that burner phone, the house felt different, like someone had changed the air without telling me. I was still acting normal, or as close to normal as I could manage. Emily didn't notice. She floated around the house with that same calm, familiar ease that I'd grown used to over the years. She kissed my cheek when she passed by, asked me about work, made small talk like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I was careful not to let her see how tightly I was gripping my coffee mug or how forced my laughter sounded when she made one of her lame jokes. The phone under her car seat had burned a hole in my brain overnight, replaying every message, every photo I'd seen. The fact that I knew what was happening, but she didn't know I knew, it gave me this strange, heavy advantage that I wasn't ready to use just yet. I wasn't going to lose control when I confronted her. She wasn't going to get the upper hand. I needed her to feel the full weight of this betrayal. And I had to do it in a way she wouldn't see coming. The opportunity came on a Wednesday. I was working from home, seated at my desk in the office, staring at lines of code I couldn't make sense of. Emily had taken the day off. She said she had some errands to run, but I didn't ask. I already knew what she was doing, where she was going. Her burner phone hadn't lit up since I found it. She probably hadn't used it since that last message, but that didn't mean she'd stopped. If anything, she'd just switched tactics. At 10 a.m., her car pulled out of the driveway. I watched from the window, hidden behind the edge of the curtain, as she drove off. I waited exactly 2 minutes, just enough time for her to get out of the neighborhood, then grabbed my keys and followed. I had no plan. I didn't know what I would do if I caught her. I didn't even know where she was going. But I couldn't sit in that house one more minute pretending everything was fine. Her route surprised me. I expected her to head into town, maybe to a hotel or a restaurant, someplace discreet. Instead, she drove about 15 miles north to one of those new lifestyle communities, the kind with identical suburban houses packed close together like rows of Lego bricks. She turned into a cul-de-sac and parked in front of a white two-story house with a navy blue door. No other cars were parked nearby. I pulled up a little further down the street, far enough not to be noticed but close enough to keep an eye on her. Emily sat in the car for a moment, checking her phone, her real phone, not the burner, then got out. She wasn't dressed for work or errands. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie she'd stolen from my closet a year ago. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail. Casual. Comfortable. She walked up to the house like she'd done it 1,000 times before, opened the door, and disappeared inside. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I was breathing heavy, almost panting, as I sat there watching the empty driveway. My mind jumped to conclusions I didn't want to face. Was he in there? Whoever C was, did he live here? Was this their place? I felt like I was suffocating. I needed answers. Before I could stop myself, I got out of the car. The walk up to the house felt like it took forever. My legs were heavy, like they didn't want to carry me forward, but I forced myself to keep moving. I climbed the steps to the front door and stood there, staring at the navy blue paint. I thought about knocking, but something stopped me. What was I going to say? Hey, I followed my wife here because I think she's screwing someone in your house? I needed to know for sure before I made a move. I glanced at the windows. The blinds were closed tight. I stepped off the porch and started walking around the side of the house, staying close to the wall. The backyard wasn't fenced in, and there was a sliding glass door leading into the kitchen. I crouched behind a row of bushes, just close enough to see through a narrow gap in the curtains. And there they were. Emily sat at the kitchen table with him. A man I'd never seen before. He looked younger, mid-30s, maybe, with short, dark hair and a clean-shaven face. He was wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Relaxed. Like this was just another normal Wednesday morning. They were talking. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. Emily's face said it all. She was smiling, laughing, even like she hadn't laughed with me in months. She leaned forward on her elbows, looking at him like he was the most fascinating person in the world. Like I didn't exist. I felt sick. It wasn't the anger that got me. Not yet. It was the sadness. The realization that whatever Emily and I used to have, that easy connection, the shared jokes, the quiet moments of understanding, she was giving that to someone else. And the worst part? She looked happy doing it. I stayed crouched there for nearly half an hour, watching as they talked, as he poured her coffee, as she touched his arm casually like it was nothing. At one point, he leaned in and kissed her. Just a quick kiss, nothing passionate, but it was enough to make my blood boil. That was it. I'd seen enough. When Emily came home later that afternoon, I was waiting for her in the living room. She looked surprised to see me sitting there, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the blank TV screen. Hey, she said cautiously, setting her purse on the entry table. What's up? I didn't answer right away. I waited until she walked closer, into the center of the room, before I looked up. Where were you today? I asked. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. I told you I had errands. What errands? Her expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of something behind her eyes. Why are you asking? I stood up slowly, keeping my voice calm. Where were you, Emily? She hesitated for half a second too long. Out. What's going on? I reached into my pocket, pulled out the black burner phone, and held it up. Her face drained of color. For the first time in years, I saw fear in her eyes. Who's C? I asked quietly. Emily stared at the phone like it might explode in my hand. She opened her mouth to speak but nothing came out. Answer me, Emily. My voice was shaking now, despite my efforts to keep calm. Who the hell is he? Her face crumpled. Eric, I. Don't lie to me. She took a step back, tears already welling in her eyes. Please, just let me explain. Explain what? I snapped, my voice rising. Explain how you've been sneaking off to some guy's house behind my back? Explain how you've been lying to me for God knows how long? It's not what you think, she cried, her voice cracking. I threw the phone on the coffee table, where it clattered loudly against the wood. Then what is it, Emily? She didn't answer. She just stood there, crying softly, her hands shaking at her sides. I stared at her for a long time, waiting, begging for her to say something that would make sense. Something I could believe. But she didn't. She just stood there, silent. And in that moment, I knew. There was nothing left to save. The silence after Emily's tears wasn't relief, it was like the hum of an engine that hadn't fully shut off. We stood there, locked in place, her sniffling quietly while I sat on the edge of the couch, hands pressed together so tightly my knuckles turned white. I was done waiting for her excuses. "Pack a bag," I said finally. My voice was low and steady, but it sounded like someone else's. Emily blinked, her red eyes searching my face. "What?" "You heard me," I repeated, staring straight at her. "Get your shit and get out of the house. Eric, please." "Now, Emily." She flinched at the sharpness in my voice. Her hands fumbled awkwardly at her sides, like she didn't know what to do with them. For a second, I thought she might try to argue or scream at me, maybe blame me for not understanding. Instead, she turned and stumbled toward the bedroom, still sobbing. I sat there listening to the sounds of her moving through our room, drawers opening, zippers being tugged, the soft thud of clothes hitting the bed. My mind was blank, too focused to allow anger or sadness. In that moment, I was a machine, steady, silent, and deliberate. She had betrayed me. Betrayal is a cancer. It doesn't just affect the moment you catch it, it spreads through everything you thought was real, rewriting your memories as it destroys them. I looked at our wedding photo on the mantel, Emily in her white dress, smiling up at me like I was her whole world. It was a lie. It had always been a lie. But if she thought she'd get to walk away without consequences, she didn't know me at all. When Emily finally came out of the bedroom, she had a duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was a mess, red eyes, streaked mascara, but I didn't care. I didn't feel pity. She stopped halfway into the living room, as if expecting me to soften. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered. "Go to his house," I said coldly, standing up. "Or get a hotel. I don't give a shit." Her lips trembled, and she looked like she wanted to say something, maybe beg for forgiveness, maybe scream that I was the bad guy here, but she turned and walked out the door without another word. The sound of it slamming shut echoed through the house. I stood there for a long time, listening to the empty silence she'd left behind. And that's when the rage finally hit. I needed to destroy her. Not in the messy, screaming way you see in movies. No. I didn't want some public fight. I didn't want her crying to her friends about how crazy I was. I wanted her to feel what I felt, betrayal that burned so deep it made her question everything. And I had just the plan to do it. The next morning, I called off work. No explanations, just a curt email to my boss saying I needed personal time. Then I got to work. Emily was still out of the house. I didn't know where she'd gone, and I didn't care. She wouldn't be coming back anytime soon, not after I was finished. The first thing I did was go to my office and pull up her emails. Emily wasn't exactly tech-savvy, and she'd made the fatal mistake of keeping all her accounts logged in on the shared computer. It took me less than 5 minutes to find everything I needed. There were emails between her and him, the man I now knew as Chris. Messages about how he made her feel alive again, and "this is the hardest decision I've ever had to make." I scrolled through their digital love letters with a mix of disgust and grim satisfaction. She'd handed me the ammunition I needed on a silver platter. Next, I printed out everything. Emails, photos, screenshots of the burner phone messages I'd already backed up. I didn't just print them, I organized them. I laid out the evidence like I was building a case in court, labeled and highlighted so there could be no room for misunderstanding. Once I had it all together, I sent the emails to 2 places, her family group chat and Chris's company email. Not his personal one, his work email. I'd done a little digging and found out Chris worked as a mid-level manager at a boring finance firm downtown. People in finance hate scandals. I wrote a simple note. To whom it may concern. I thought you'd like to know what Chris has been up to. Attached are the relevant details. And I attached everything. When I hit send, I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. My hands were steady, my breathing calm. There was no going back now. I had started the fire. The fallout didn't take long. Chris's office blew up within hours. Emily's texts to me started flooding in around noon, frantic, desperate messages asking what I'd done, begging me to stop. I ignored every single one. I didn't owe her a response. Around 2 p.m., my phone rang. Emily. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Then again. Finally, after the fourth time, I picked up. What the hell did you do? Her voice was high-pitched, breathless, like she'd been crying all day. What I had to, I replied calmly. They fired him, Eric. He lost his job. Do you know what you've done? I almost laughed. She was yelling at me? After what she'd done? You ruined your own life, Emily. I just made sure everyone knew about it. This isn't fair, she screamed. I hung up before she could finish. I wasn't interested in what she had to say. That night, I went to bed alone in our now quiet house. I stared at the empty space where Emily's clothes used to hang and felt nothing. No relief. No satisfaction. Just emptiness. Revenge doesn't fix what's broken, I realized. It doesn't undo what happened or take away the sting of betrayal. It just leaves you standing in the ashes, wondering what the hell you're supposed to do next. But at least I wasn't the only one in the ashes. Emily had tried to destroy our marriage behind my back, piece by piece. She thought she could get away with it. Walk away unscathed. Now she knew better. And so did Chris. The day after I blew everything up, I sat alone in the house. I had no appetite. I barely moved from the chair in the living room where I'd spent the night nursing a bottle of whiskey. Sunlight poured through the window, harsh and unwelcome, making everything look too bright, too real. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. My phone sat on the coffee table, buzzing periodically. Emily's name flashed on the screen every few minutes, but I didn't pick up. Her texts were just more of the same: apologies, explanations, and accusations. Eric, please, we need to talk. Just once. You've destroyed my life. You're not the man I married. What do you want from me? Do you want me to beg? I read every single one but didn't reply. She didn't get to decide when I was ready to talk. I would face her when I chose to, not because she couldn't handle the mess she'd created. By the third day, my anger had dulled into something heavier: exhaustion. The adrenaline of revenge had worn off, and now all I had left was the emptiness I'd been trying to avoid. As much as I hated her, I couldn't dodge the fact that at one point, I'd loved her. Really loved her. So I finally called her. Come to the house, I said. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. She didn't ask questions. She just agreed, her voice trembling as if she thought I'd slammed the door in her face when she got here. Emily arrived later that evening. I watched her car pull into the driveway from my spot at the living room window. She hesitated before opening the door, like she was gathering the courage to face me. For the briefest second, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd married, the woman who had smiled at me over candlelit dinners and whispered plans about our future late at night. But that woman was dead now, buried under layers of lies and betrayal. She finally stepped out of the car, clutching her purse tightly, and walked to the door. I let her knock twice before I opened it. Her face was pale, and her eyes were swollen. She looked like hell. For some reason, seeing her like that didn't make me feel better. You're here, I said flatly, stepping aside to let her in. She looked around the house like she didn't recognize it anymore. Or maybe she just didn't want to. Her eyes lingered on the empty spaces where some of her things had been, things she'd grabbed in a hurry when I kicked her out. Do you want to sit? I asked, motioning to the couch. Emily nodded mutely and sat down on the edge, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I stayed standing, arms crossed, looking down at her. For a minute, we just stared at each other. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until Emily finally broke it. Eric, her voice was quiet, like she was afraid to speak too loudly. I don't know where to start. How about with the truth? I replied coldly. She winced. You already know the truth. No, I shot back, narrowing my eyes. I know the facts. The messages, the photos, the lies. But I don't know why. So tell me. Why did you do it, Emily? She dropped her gaze to her lap, fiddling with the strap of her purse. Her hands were shaking. I don't know, she whispered. Bullshit, I snapped. You don't get to sit there and play dumb. You had an affair. 4 months. You made a choice over and over again. So don't tell me you don't know why. Her eyes shot up to meet mine, and for the first time in days, I saw anger flash across her face. You think this is all on me, she said sharply. Like you're some perfect husband who never made mistakes? Do you know how lonely I was, Eric? Lonely? I laughed bitterly. We lived together. We slept in the same bed. You couldn't have been that lonely. You were never there, she shot back, her voice rising. You were always working. Always staring at a screen, talking about deadlines and projects. Even when you were in the room, you weren't really there. I felt invisible. Oh, so that makes it okay? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I wasn't giving you enough attention, so you ran off and screwed some guy behind my back? She flinched again, but this time she didn't look away. I'm not saying it was okay. I'm saying it happened because I was miserable, and I didn't know how to fix it. You didn't know how to fix it? I repeated, shaking my head. You could have talked to me, Emily. You could have told me how you felt. You didn't even try. You just gave up on us. I didn't give up, she said weakly. Then what do you call it? I shot back. Because to me, it sure as hell looks like you gave up. She didn't answer. Her face crumpled, and for a second, I thought she might start crying again. But instead, she took a deep breath and looked me straight in the eyes. Do you still love me? She asked quietly. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I didn't know how to answer. Did I love her? Could I? I thought about the woman I'd married, the woman who used to look at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I thought about the years we'd spent building a life together, the plans we'd made, the dreams we'd shared. And then I thought about that burner phone. Those messages. Her smile as she sat across the table from another man. No, I said finally. My voice was cold and steady. I don't. Emily flinched, like the words had physically hit her. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears, but they spilled over anyway. Is that it, then? She whispered. Is this the end? What did you expect? I said harshly. You think we could come back from this? You think I could just pretend it didn't happen? No, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to do now. I stared at her for a long moment. I'd spent days imagining this conversation, thinking about what I'd say, how I'd hurt her the way she hurt me. But now that it was happening, all I felt was tired. You'll figure it out, I said finally. You always do. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up slowly. Where do we go from here? I walked to the front door and opened it. We don't. She looked at me for a long time, like she was trying to memorize my face, then stepped out onto the porch. I didn't say goodbye. I just closed the door behind her and locked it. I leaned back against the door, staring at the empty living room. It was over. Whatever we'd been, whatever we'd had, it was gone. And now, for the first time in 6 years, I was alone. After Emily left, the house became a tomb. Everything felt still and hollow, like I was living in the shell of what used to be my life. Every room I walked into had a reminder of her, a sweater she left draped over a chair, a hair tie in the bathroom, the faint smell of her perfume lingering on the sheets. I spent the first few days cleaning. Not because I cared about tidying up, but because I needed her presence gone. I stripped the sheets, bagged up every piece of clothing she'd left behind, and threw out the cheap candles she'd insisted on buying for every corner of the house. Her wedding dress, still neatly stored in the back of the closet, went in a box in the garage. I didn't throw it out. Not yet. The hardest part was the photos. Frames from our wedding, our vacations, our old apartment when we could barely afford rent. I didn't smash them like I wanted to, that would have been too easy, too impulsive. Instead, I set them in a drawer, face down, one by one, until the walls felt clean. Empty, but clean. When I was done, I sat in the middle of the living room floor, the light from the window casting harsh lines across the carpet. It was the first time I'd really felt alone in years. Alone, not lonely, like she claimed to have been. Just alone. I poured myself a drink and thought about everything. On Monday, my lawyer called. "Eric, I've drafted the paperwork as you requested," he said. "It's straightforward, no assets to divide since the house is in your name. Given the evidence you provided, this should be quick." He was talking about the burner phone screenshots, the emails, and everything else I'd collected. I hadn't just sent those to her family and Chris's work. I'd sent them to my lawyer too. Emily wouldn't be able to contest a thing. "Thanks, Roger," I said. My voice was flat, emotionless. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "Okay. Well, you can sign and file whenever you're ready." I hung up without saying goodbye. Emily tried to contact me a few more times that week. Calls. Texts. Once, she even showed up outside the house. I spotted her car parked across the street while I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers Roger had sent over. For a moment, I thought about going outside, facing her one last time. But I didn't. I grabbed the papers, flipped through them with a pen in hand, and started signing. By the time I finished, I glanced back out the window. Her car was gone. Good. Filing for divorce wasn't as satisfying as I thought it would be. There was no sense of triumph when I handed the paperwork to the clerk at the courthouse. The woman behind the desk barely looked at me as she stamped the forms and slid them into a folder. To her, I was just another guy filing for divorce on a Tuesday afternoon. And I guess that's what I was. Just another guy who thought his life was perfect until the rug got pulled out from under him. As I walked back to my car, I wondered if Emily had told Chris yet. I wondered if they were still seeing each other, or if my little scorched earth campaign had turned him into another casualty of her mess. Maybe he blamed her. Maybe she blamed him. It didn't matter. I didn't care about their story, only that it wasn't my story anymore. I sat in my car for a while, watching the sun set behind the rows of buildings. For the first time since this started, I let myself really think about what happened. Not just what she did, but why. She said she felt invisible. I thought back to the last year of our marriage. How many nights I spent working late, sitting at my desk while Emily sat alone in the living room watching some show I didn't care about. How many times I tuned her out when she tried to talk to me about her day. Maybe I was there physically, but she wasn't wrong, I hadn't really been there. I wasn't absolving her. She made her choice. But maybe she didn't fall out of love with me so much as she fell out of being seen by me. And maybe I'd let that happen without even realizing it. It didn't change what she'd done, and it sure as hell didn't mean I'd take her back. But I told myself that I'd never let that happen again if I ever got the chance to love someone again. A month passed. Emily signed the divorce papers without a fight. I didn't hear much else from her, other than one email that showed up late at night. It was short. "I'm sorry. I hope someday you can forgive me." I deleted it without replying. The truth is, I didn't know if I'd ever forgive her. I wasn't even sure forgiveness mattered. What difference did it make if I forgave her or not? She wasn't part of my life anymore, and that was enough. My days started to feel normal again, or at least a version of normal I could accept. I went back to work, took on new projects, and forced myself to go out with friends on weekends instead of sitting at home. They didn't bring up the divorce much, most of them didn't know the details, and I wasn't about to tell them. One Saturday, I decided to clean out the garage. It was the last part of the house I hadn't touched since Emily left. I found her wedding dress box shoved in the corner, covered in dust. I stared at it for a long time before I dragged it out to the curb. The garbage truck would pick it up on Monday. It felt like closure. That night, I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, listening to the sound of crickets in the yard. It was a warm night, and the stars were clearer than usual. I thought about what was next. For months, my whole life had been focused on Emily's betrayal, finding out, confronting her, destroying everything. But now that it was over, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea where to go. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let this define me. I wouldn't spend the rest of my life bitter and angry, replaying Emily's mistakes in my head. I'd wasted enough time on her already. The life we'd built together was over, but that didn't mean my life was over. It just meant I had to build something new. I finished my beer and went inside, shutting the door behind me. Tomorrow was a new day. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for it.